the fact that the Russians, or that Vladimir Putin, out of desperation, are turning to countries such as North Korea and Iran to help them in their desperate struggle to win a war against tiny, relatively speaking, Ukraine next door, is a matter of great concern to many in the US who are very critical of Iran.
Let's come on to what the return of Donald Trump to the White House means for Ukraine. Certainly in the build-up to the US election, among Ukraine supporters, there was a certain pessimism about what a Trump presidency would mean for Ukraine. I suspect in recent weeks, I've sort of picked up on, I don't know whether it's a bit of bargaining based on the reality of the situation or whether it is actually grounded in reality, but a little more optimism about potentially what a Trump administration might mean, than it wouldn't necessarily mean selling Ukraine out. What is your sense, Leigh, of what a Trump presidency may mean for Ukraine in the war?
Undoubtedly, a Trump victory, which we have now seen in the US elections, is not what Ukraine was hoping for. And I'm sure that Vladimir Putin and people in the Kremlin were delighted with that Trump victory, simply because Trump and his supporters have consistently talked about cutting military and economic aid to Ukraine. We saw this between October 2023 and April 2024, that the US stopped providing military support to Ukraine, and that crippled Ukraine's war effort and saw rapid Russian advances. So that threat is extremely concerning to Ukraine. For the reasons that I've already set out, there are glimmers of hope. We can point to Trump being very unpredictable. We can point to Trump not wanting to hand victory to Russia on a plate. But it is quite concerning. And if Trump were to cut military supplies to Ukraine, the question then would be, is the UK and our other friends of Ukraine, such as in the European Union, ready to ramp up their military supplies to meet US shortfalls? And this would be a huge challenge. It would really mean transforming our support. Now, my view on this has always been that should Trump cut supplies to Ukraine, it would still be a really good investment for UK taxpayers and for the UK in general to up our support to Ukraine, because the alternative, letting Russia win this war, would be immensely more dangerous for us. It would create a much more dangerous world where a nuclear-armed, bigger Russia incorporating elements of Ukraine into Russian territory would be a more dangerous adversary, more likely to attack again. And other countries all around the world that have thought, I'd like to invade my neighbor, but I'll never get away with it, will think, actually, I might get away with it. I'm going to invade my neighbor. And the UK would be in a much more dangerous international environment where our defense spending would be orders of magnitude greater than it is now, whereas supporting Ukraine would be relatively cheap compared with that. So I think we have to hope for the best with Trump, but prepare for the worst. And the worst means preparing to up our consistent long-term aid to Ukraine to stop Russia from winning this war.
What have you made of some of the mood music that's come out of the Trump campaign, or now soon to be the Trump administration, in recent weeks? I mean, for example, there was this idea of a demilitarized zone, a DMZ, between Russia and Ukraine, almost akin to what we have between North and South Korea. Do you think that is in any way feasible?
I'm very concerned about any settlement that freezes the front line where it is now, because that, in effect, means giving Russia victory. Supposing you had a demilitarized zone between what is currently, those parts of Ukraine currently occupied by Russia, and the rest of Ukraine, which Russia has not yet managed to invade. Russia would steam ahead with integrating those elements that it has occupied into Russia. You may recall that they've already passed legislation integrating huge swathes of Ukraine into Russia, an area about the size of England. Something like 18% of Ukraine is currently occupied by Russia. So that would be a disaster for Ukraine to freeze the front line where it is now. I've seen suggestions that you could sweeten this pill or take the edge off such a disastrous outcome by saying, first of all, that that land remains part of Ukraine legally, but Ukraine continues to occupy it for the time being. This would be what's known as the East German model, where Western countries never accepted that East Germany was a separate country or that it was going to be part of Russia. I mean, they did eventually, some of them set up embassies in East Berlin, but it was still seen as being part of Germany. And you could do that with Ukraine, where areas occupied by Russia, such as Crimea or eastern Ukraine, were recognized as still being part of Ukraine in a longer term settlement. That's one option. But this would be a very tricky path to go down. And for me, I'm afraid, allowing Russia to keep territory which it has seized by force against international law would not only mean Russia winning this war, and Putin winning this war, but would also, as I said earlier, make the world a more dangerous place by encouraging other countries suddenly to see, actually, we can invade and occupy our neighbours without long-term consequences.
On that note, in terms of trying to persuade Donald Trump and his administration to be more sympathetic towards Ukraine, do you think one of the stronger arguments that Ukraine allies can make is that, look, Vladimir Putin is allying himself through the use of Iranian drones, for instance, with Tehran, which is an enemy of America. It is increasingly building an alliance with North Korea and also China. Do you think that is an argument to which Donald Trump and his administration may be more sympathetic? Because very often your sense is, particularly if you read the outlandish tweets, for instance, of Donald Trump Jr., that they see Ukraine as just being this far-flung country in Eastern Europe, which matters little to the average American.
There is always a strong trend or tendency towards isolationism in the US. There's a kind of two tracks of foreign policy within the US. One is to say the rest of the world is a long way away. The US, the United States, has this privileged geographical position where its only land neighbors are Mexico and Canada, and it's a long way from its enemies. So there has always been a trend of thought in the US that all these faraway foreign countries are not our concern. We should leave them to get on with it while we build our own wealth and prosperity at home. And before the First World War, before the Second World War, there were strong schools of thought in the US that the US shouldn't get involved. However, when US interests are threatened, the US does tend to reverse its isolationist tendency and become involved. We saw this in 9/11, of course, after 9/11, after the attacks on the World Trade Center and on Washington in 2001, where the US had been saying, well, the Middle East peace process and what happens in the Middle East is really nothing to do with us. And then after those attacks, they provoked the US into becoming very engaged in the Middle East, perhaps not to the benefit of the US or anyone else. And so you're right, James, that the fact that the Russians or that Vladimir Putin, out of desperation, are turning to countries such as North Korea and Iran to help them in their desperate struggle to win a war against tiny, relatively speaking, Ukraine next door, is a matter of great concern to many in the US who are very critical of Iran. And you will remember that in the first Trump presidency, President Trump said he would solve the problem of North Korea's nuclear weapons program very quickly. He entered into negotiations with the North Korean leader and even shook his hand in order to show that he was going to make a deal, and didn't get anywhere. And since then, the North Korean nuclear program has continued, and North Korea is becoming more and more aggressive. So it could well be that there will be strategic thinkers in the US who regard Russia's embrace of these pariah states as being sufficiently serious to give them pause for thought in cutting their support for Ukraine. But we can't count on that happening. And in my view, the UK and other countries need to step up their long-term military and economic support to Ukraine to reduce the risk of any cutting of US support, making a Russian victory inevitable.
And just finally, in terms of one of those countries that may hopefully step up, we need to talk about the situation in Germany, because there's been a lot of focus on domestic politics in the US. But of course, Olaf Scholz's government in Germany has collapsed, and there will be new elections in short order. How significant is that potentially for the future of Ukraine?
It's potentially extremely serious. On the one hand, we can see that Russia is, like Ukraine, in terrible trouble militarily. Of course, Ukraine's under enormous pressure, but so is Russia. Russia is running out of troops, it's running out of equipment, all these tanks and armored vehicles it's been taking out of long-term storage, they're just running out. The Russian economy is in all kinds of trouble. These long-term sanctions are slowly crippling Russia's ability to fight a war. So this is all good. On the other hand, Russia has been hoping since launching the war back in February 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that the alliance of Ukraine supporters, that is the US, the UK, and EU countries, plus some others like South Korea and Japan, Russia has been hoping that that alliance will splinter. And the longer this goes on, this war, the more likely it is that that alliance will splinter, because unlike in Russia, all those countries that are supporting Ukraine are subject to democratic elections. And that means that there is constant pressure on them to come up with new policies or to change their policies. Now, we saw just recently a call from Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, to Putin for the first time that he'd spoken to him, I think, since 2022. And many people saw that as being the German Chancellor responding to pressure from other political parties in Germany, in particular the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, which is a right-wing party, and the Bund Sarah Wagenknecht, which is an extreme left-wing party, both of which support Russia in this war. And the fact that Scholz was facing electoral problems led him to make a call to Putin. Now, the Germans say that Scholz condemned Russia's attack and called on Moscow to negotiate for a fair peace, and talked about Germany's unwavering determination to support Ukraine. Nonetheless, the long-term pressures on Western countries, including, of course, in the UK, mean that we always have to be alert to countries weakening their support. And in Germany, we see that there are many streams of thought, just as there are actually in France, or indeed now in the US, where there is always a risk that some of these countries may weaken their support for Ukraine. So we need to be steadfast in supporting Kiev.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.